Good morning. My name is Donovan Bigelow. I'm the psychology instructor here at Renton Technical College. What you're about to hear and see is a series of lectures on the psychology of human relations. Now, you might want to know why you're watching all of this. First reason is it's absolutely necessary for RTC to establish a solid basis for your education as well as your training. And so the state legislature has mandated that any program in the technical college system that has more than 44 credits has to have a block of instruction on human relations, mathematics, and English. So there's two reasons why you need to know this material. One, it's necessary to keep this college running and keep your programs alive. And two, it's important for your own success. So what you should have in front of you now is an outline of the lectures I'm about to give, lecture notes, and I will track these lecture notes through the next 3 or 4 hours. Step 1, Part 1, Introduction to Human Relations. I'm on page 5 of the lecture notes. And perhaps the question that's most important for you right now is not some programmatic question of what's necessary for RTC's certification. All that's nice. Your instructors care about that. What you probably care about more is what's in it for me. And my answer to that is simply this. The more you understand about yourself and those around you, the more likely it will be that you will make better, more adaptive, and more successful decisions. This material, I believe, will allow you, will help you to become successful in whatever program you're in, and beyond that, in whatever job you end up having. And frankly, I think it will also help you in your own personal relationships. This is a series of lectures on human relations. The bulk of it is related directly to your work in organizations, in businesses, in the world of work, but I think everything that I tell you is going to have direct applicability to your intimate relationships, your personal relationships, your family. So this is a bit of a global overview of who you are in organizations, who you are in relationships, and I believe that your personal and professional success depends on it. The texts in human relations cite over and over again studies, interviews with business managers, and their consistent advice is that human relation skills are more important than technical skills. There's a lot of good nurses out there, there's a lot of good mechanics out there, surveyors, all the different programs that RTC has available, which can give you and will give you the technical skills. What they won't give you and can't be expected to give you are decent human relation skills. That has to be done on your own. And I'd like to think these lectures can help you with that. But it's absolutely clear from managers over the course of decades of interviews that if you don't get along with others, you're not going to go along with the program, with the business very long. Second thing on page 5 of the notes, human relations are not just common sense. They are listed as common sense. And I've got lists of things that the literature on human relations says you're supposed to do. But what's clear to me over and over is that it isn't obvious. It isn't common sense. It isn't very common at all. It has to be understood at a deeper level. And the reasons why it isn't so common need to be understood. Your inability sometimes to get along with others has to do with them and you and how you interact. I believe that this material will help you make sense of those situations and, again, help you come out on the other end more successful. Third point, successful workers and successful leaders are not born, they are self-made. This also comes through in the literature. Nobody's a born leader. Yes, we all come into this world with our own unique genetic package. Yes, given the evolution of the human species over the millions of years, we do have certain attributes that are common to all of us, and I'm going to talk about those in a later lecture. But it seems clear as well that whatever we start with in this world, we can make the most of it. And those who do become the leaders, become the successful workers, maximize their potential, take charge of their lives and their careers in ways that make them more successful. That's the purpose ultimately of these lectures. Next point. The goal of human relations is to achieve both individual and organizational goals together. It seems to me that we are long beyond the point where workers and management can afford to fight each other. One of the points coming up quickly is this idea of globalization. We are now no longer so isolated, and anyone that's been paying attention for more than 5 minutes to the news can see that. So it's critical that we recognize, that management recognize, and that the workers recognize that we're in this together. And the success of the individual should be the goal of management, and the success of the business should be the goal of the workers. Their interests are not in conflict in perhaps the way they used to be. We're in conflict with others now. We need to be together. Benjamin Franklin said during the American Revolution, we must all hang together or we will assuredly hang separately. I think if you understand that, it's more applicable today, or as applicable today as it was over 240 years ago. The second to the last note on page 5, the total person approach, not just job skills. This is maybe a variation on that human relation skills are more important than technical skills idea that I just talked about. Businesses don't want a robot putting widgets into a piece of machinery. They want a human being, a total person, someone who can think for themselves, do for themselves, become a creative force multiplier, is a phrase that I used to use in the Army. Force multiplier. Do you have the ability to bring what you have to the job that bring everything that you have, not just a technical skill, screwing in a bolt, or giving a shot, or whatever other programmatic skills you're going to learn here, but can you be the kind of person that, and this doesn't require commitment in some absolute sense, except perhaps to yourself, a commitment to yourself, to be all you can be. I'm going to throw Army things in here now and then because I spent 12.5 years in the Army. So that's, I think, what this material is about, how to help you, how to help your business maintain itself so you can keep a job. That seems to be the goal here. Performance and interacting levels of behavior. Those levels are the individual, the group, and the organization. And one of the tricky things about human relations that it's taken me a long time to figure out is that people react differently by themselves when they're in small groups or when they're in large groups. I think most people intuitively get that. You all know, you've seen it in the news often enough, individuals tend to be very smart. People in groups tend to be very dumb sometimes. Gang members, people in large political organizations can do things that seem so ridiculous when they're in the grip of kind of a group dynamic. And if you can understand that level of involvement, what you do yourself, how you interact with others in small group settings, and how being in a large organization affects you and your tendency to do things one way or the other, then forewarned is forearmed. You're much more likely to make better decisions. All right, page 6 of the notes. It's very clear that today things are different than they've been before. Yes, it's true, human nature remains basically the same, but our current challenges are a bit unique, and if you don't understand them, you're going to have a hard time functioning effectively in any organization. Number 1, government intrusion. If you spent more than 5 minutes watching the news, it's clear that the government, both at the state, federal, and local level, is getting bigger, more impactful. Your businesses, whatever you're in, your employment, you personally are going to be impacted by this increasing governmental presence. If you don't recognize it, if you don't see the complexity that it throws into managers' calculations and how then, of course, that affects the workers down below them, you end up generating a resentment or anger or frustration that may not have anything to do with your bosses or the organization you're in, but it's coming from a higher level. Just recognizing that sometimes takes some of the pressure off. As if that wasn't big enough pressure, second point, globalization. Has anybody bought anything lately that hasn't come from China? We are now in a world so interrelated, so globalized, that things that happen everywhere else in the world seem to affect us. We can no longer function in a village being self-sufficient unto ourselves. We are affected by everyone. And this is, I think, the key point in one of my initial comments. You and your employers are on the same team. It's possible that 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, there were significant conflicts between business and management and workers. and it was resolved the way it was resolved. But right now, most of the time, the interests of the businessmen, the interests of the managers, and the interests of the workers are more aligned now than they ever have been, because the opposition isn't coming internally. The danger to your job is coming mostly externally. And if you realize that, then all of a sudden what managers are doing makes some sense, and you can prepare yourself more honestly and effectively for a globalized marketplace. Number 3, innovation and technology. When I was an undergraduate, when I was sitting out in the chairs where you are, I did all of my tests with pen and ink and paper. No one had computers. They were just starting. The information revolution, the technology revolution, is transforming every single job in America. And I confess I'm a little bit behind the times. These lectures done on DVDs are a technological miracle as far as I'm concerned. And you will have to recognize that in your field, whatever it is, whether it's auto mechanicking or surveying or nursing or whatever other program you're here at RTC to learn, the technology revolution is right in your face. If you don't understand the cutting edge of high tech, you're going to have to learn to stay relevant in your particular job. And it doesn't matter what job that is. We are dominated by innovation, change, and technological change that's transforming the American workplace seemingly on a daily basis. Ethics. What are the rules and why those? Without going down this road too far, just mentioning it a little. What are the rules in business? What are the rules in the workplace now? Whose rules are they? Where do they come from? What's forbidden? What's accepted? Where are the gray areas? How much room to maneuver do you have? This is critical that you understand, because, and here's where it gets tricky, people in groups, as I mentioned before, don't often behave rationally. And you see it over and over again. People in business, workers, middle management, senior executives, they end up doing things that get themselves in a tremendous amount of trouble, that if you go back and look at their decision-making process, you wonder, what were they thinking? How is this possible? This is just stupid. It's ridiculous. And what you find most of the time is that if you go back, you find that there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 people in a room, in a committee, and they're all talking, and they all agree it's a good idea. Why? Because, is it a good idea? Probably not. But they all want to get on board. They all want to be on the team, and so they all agree. It reminds me of a movie, not a movie, a news broadcast I saw years ago. It was about sheep ranching. And they showed a bunch of sheep being let out of a pen. And for some reason, the first sheep jumped. There was nothing to jump over. They were being let out of the pen into the field, and the little sheep jumped. What did the rest of the sheep do? They all jumped. Why? Because there was something to go over? No, because the first one did it. And every once in a while I see something like that, and I see people behaving in businesses. I see workers bending the rules or thinking they're justified in doing something they ought to know is wrong or dangerous or foolhardy or not very useful at the very least. And I see them operating in this group mentality. A clear understanding of the ethics in your particular field are essential. No profession in America today that I'm aware of does not have its own individual, carefully honed mostly by lawyers, carefully honed body of ethics. I strongly recommend, as difficult as they are to read sometimes, that you take a look at them and pay attention to your own internal experience of anxiety, of fear, of danger. When someone suggests doing something you have a sense is a problem, try to find the courage to say this might be a problem. And I think you probably, if you've been in any organization at all, know how hard that is sometimes. Nobody likes the squeaky wheel. Nobody likes the guy who's the wet blanket who tries to stop what everyone else thinks is such a good idea. But unless you have an understanding of your profession's ethical grounding, you are likely to get yourself and perhaps your group or organization into some trouble. Next thing, crises, safety and security. This is new, at least new in the last 100 years. There simply wasn't any serious threat, any serious danger in being in a work environment, at least unless you were in the mining field or some inherent inherently dangerous field, you weren't very often endangered by others coming into the workplace or co-workers. It seems lately, whether it's school shootings or disruptions at the post office or elsewhere in other businesses, we seem to be increasing in the external threats and a mindfulness of the security implications of your organization, I think is essential for everyone's, A, peace of mind. You can't be an effective, efficient, productive, creative worker if you're looking over your shoulder, okay? So being mindful of the security issues is critical. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. I want to emphasize again this last point. Old short-term conflict approach versus unity of long-term interest. I can't emphasize enough that human relations as a field is starting to recognize. I've reviewed a dozen texts before putting these lectures together, and what I see as a big change over time is this recognition that we're all in the same boat. We sink or swim together, and the old idea of aggressively managing internal conflict in a business seems now almost ancient history and certainly counterproductive. All right. Next thing, learning from experience and the 9 human relations guidelines. I want to spend some time with these. This is the common sense I was talking about before. In every human relations textbook, there's a list of these. And they sound so obvious, I almost have to apologize. It sounds boring, it sounds ridiculous to have to even mention these, but I want to be specific about the nuts and bolts of them, because you can't just pass over them and blow them off as some boring academic intellectual's recitation of common sense, because they're not. They're more subtle than that. Here they are, page 6. Be optimistic. Be positive. Be genuinely interested in others. Smile and develop a sense of humor. Call people by name. Listen to people. Help others and think before you act. Does anyone think there's any problem with any of these things? Of course not. If these were so easy, if this was so obvious, if this was so grounded in all of our common sense, there wouldn't be any need for human relations lectures. What I think these lists are the highest aspirational goals. This is what we strive for, and very few people actually achieve them in any meaningful, grounded, consistent way. And the reason we don't is the subject of human relations. And I want to walk through just some introductory remarks on each of these to sort of set the stage for the rest. Be optimistic. Everyone knows that the optimist in a group is generally appreciated, and the pessimist, the downer, is often shunted aside. Nobody likes to have their parade rained on continually. You've all known someone who's sort of an upbeat, positive guy. They're the ones you want to hang out with. My question is, how did they get that way? And if you're not optimistic, if you are not optimistic about your job, about your career, about your life, about your relationships, the key question for you is, do you really understand why? And if you don't, you should, because unless you do, you can't fix it, okay? We're going to spend some time on all of these. Be optimistic, be positive. Same sort of thing. I think these two could actually be one. Be positive, be optimistic. Positive is, I think, in the here and now. If there's a mission, you take charge of it. If the boss gives you a mission to accomplish, yes, sir, I can handle this. Yes, ma'am, we're on it. We can get this done. If there's problems, you go back to them for clarification. But when you get a mission from someone, you take charge and run with it, and you give them the impression, hopefully sincerely, that you fully intend and are capable of making it happen. Be optimistic, be positive. Be genuinely interested in others. The idea that you have to get along to go along to get along, you have to be related to people in a positive way. You have to be genuinely interested. Everyone knows that the person on the work floor who self-isolates, who doesn't talk to anybody, who's always texting, who's always online, who's gaming, who doesn't have any personal relationships is not going to last very long. Doesn't matter what the field is, this seems to be a trend that's increasing across the board. You have to recognize if that's your basic personality style, if that's the way you relate to others on the job, it's critical that you take a sort of self-inventory of that and try to figure out how you can, in fact, be interested in others in a genuine way. And that shouldn't be hard to do, because People are interesting by and large. Great literature, great movies are all about really complex, interesting people. And I challenge you to look around you in the workplace and see who around you has an interesting story, has an interesting life, has something to teach you by their example. If that's the way you approach others in your organization, you'll be fine. The next thing is smile and develop a sense of humor. It's almost embarrassing to have to say that. It seems like a variation on the theme. Of course you should smile, be positive, be optimistic. How do you develop a sense of humor? If you don't have one, how do you get one? It sounds like a simple or almost silly question, but it really isn't. I think a sense of humor is one of those great and rare achievements. I don't think you just have it. I think it's developed over time. And I think when we get to the next section on self-development, I think that'll make more sense. Now, on the other hand, you all know the practical joker, the class cut-up, the class clown. At some point they're funny, and at some point they become a pain in the backside. Humor often masks hostility. If you can't tell the difference between your own joke when it's funny and when it's a pointed barb at someone else's expense, you're going to alienate yourself in the workplace. So you have to be careful with humor. You have to recognize where it's coming from within you, or it's likely to blow up in your face. Now, the next one, I'm on bottom of page 6 of the lecture notes. Call people by name. If you don't, most people feel unseen, unheard, almost shown some level of disrespect. If you're going to be in a workplace environment with folks around you, and the vast majority of you are, then take the time to get people's names right and to use them. Now, personally, I'm lousy with names. I have to stop, say the person's name when I first meet them, when I shake hands with them, say it out to them, make sure I get it right, and then when the conversation is over, try to solidify it in my mind. I'm not very good at remembering names. I have to work on that. I don't think that's a skill that comes naturally. I think you have to work on it. But what I have found consistently is that people who treat other people like that are appreciated, are respected. That if other people feel like you care about them, assuming it's authentic in even a little way, then you're much more likely to build a healthier relationship in the workplace. Same thing with the next item, listen to people. If you know all the answers, or think you do, if you think your coworkers around you don't have anything to contribute, you're in trouble. Everybody in your workplace knows something you don't. Everybody's got their own lifetime experiences, and the odds are they're bringing something to the table that you might find useful if you can listen. Now, why wouldn't you listen? Many people can't listen because they're insecure. They feel like if someone else knows something they don't, then they're in danger. They feel anxiety, so they try to overwhelm them with what they know. The word narcissism comes to mind here without being too technical. So be patient, breathe, slow down, listen to what other people on the job site have to say. Engage in an honest dialogue. Dialogue means that you are open to the possibility that the person you're listening to might have something important and useful to say that you might benefit from. If you can approach your relationships on the job that way, you will be head and shoulders above most folks. If you don't, if you find yourself in the moment trying to impose your will, trying to dominate the conversation, resisting what someone else is saying, then you got to ask yourself, what's that about? Maybe you know better than they do. Maybe that's true. And you got to be able to tell the difference between a reality-based idea that is better, that should be accepted by the organization, and your own sense of insecurity that makes it just very important that you be right. Those two things are very different. If you can't tell the difference in terms of your own motivation, you're in trouble. If you can listen to people. Think before you act. Well, duh. Of course you think before you act, but why don't people? Very often because they're scared. Because anxiety is driving us so often to do things that allow us to manage the anxiety more than succeed in what we're trying to do. I'm going to use this example a couple of times later. I see 3 ways of being. Donovan Bigelow's simple little 3-way dividing lines. right here in the middle. This is where we need to be. We think, we speak, we act according to reality. Our emotions are congruent with reality. Most of the time, we say what we mean what we say, and what we do is consistent with all of that. That's the ideal. That's the goal. But most of the time, we don't operate there, unfortunately. Very often, we repress, we deny, we use Freud's defense mechanisms. Freud is now in our culture. He's in our language. Everyone knows what I mean when I say, oh, she's so in denial. All right? That means that anxiety has overridden reality, that you can't handle. Jack Nicholson in the movie A Few Good Men a long time ago. You can't handle the truth, he yells at the Tom Cruise character. And the truth was he was correct in that movie. They couldn't handle the truth. The sad truth is most people can't. At least can't handle all of the truth. So we repress, we deny. And then to that extent, we don't deal with reality very well. And unfortunately, that kind of repression, that kind of emotional denial builds up, and it ends up sometimes poking up over here, the third category, what Freud called acting out. It's like a pressure cooker. You push too much here, it pops up over here. Sometimes when you get angry, you just stuff it. You pretend like nothing's wrong. And you do that long enough, and pretty soon you have a blow up. You throw the ashtray across the room, you storm out and slam the door, you yell and scream. Bad things happen when you let that happen. So the goal here is to stay in the middle place, thinking, speaking, feeling, and behaving all in reality as much as you can. It's a goal. We never achieve it perfectly. Think before you act is a way to perhaps think about these three ways of being and ask yourself, think, where am I? Am I in that place of reality? Am I denying, repressing, pretending? Or am I, God help us all, acting out? This is almost dangerous over here. Okay. If you're in an organization and change needs to be done, there's only three possibilities. You change the other person who's causing the problem, you change the situation or the organization, or you change yourself. The odds are you have no power, you have no ability to change anybody else around you, okay? You just don't. Can you change the organization you're in? Probably not either. You are in a job, you are in a field, and structurally you may or may not, at your level right now, have much say over how it's done. The only thing that you can change is yourself. And I think, hopefully, with the help of these lectures, you will get some help doing that. It's the thing you can do best, and I hope I can help you do that. Okay. Top of page 7. Be patient with me for the next half hour or so. I have to walk you through some history. There's no other way to do it. What are human relations? What does it mean to be a self in relationship? And I wish I didn't have to do this. I wish I could just talk about the here and now, but it seems to me that unless you get something about where our culture has been historically, it's hard really to understand where we are. If you don't understand where you've been, you can't really know where you are in the moment. So again, be patient. I'll try to make this as painless as possible, but I think unless you get this stuff, then you will never truly take in the usefulness of human relations. All right. The phrase that was thrown out in the 60s by a French philosopher named Ricoeur, he talked about the masters of suspicion. Okay, and there's a list of them there underneath that phrase. Just go with me for a few minutes on this. Who was Copernicus? Nikolai Copernicus. In 1515, he decided, using his telescopes and his mathematical calculations, that the Earth went around the sun. Now, you all know that now. You've learned that before kindergarten. But back then, in 1515, where the Catholic Church was the center of European culture and power, the core of their theology was that the Earth was the center of the universe, and man was at the center of that, because that's where God put us. Copernicus showed, and 60 years later, Galileo confirmed that that wasn't true. So imagine yourself for a moment. You're a little Polish farmer, and you're walking through the field doing your thing, and you hear from your neighbor that this colleague of this countryman of yours, Copernicus, has come up with this idea. But the Catholic Church got this one wrong. What's the next question you ask? Might it be, what else did they get wrong? If they got that one wrong, what else might be not as they say? And you become suspicious. That event seems to have begun a 500-year cultural shift. Darwin came along next in the 1840s. Things started to roll fairly quickly. Darwin went around the world in the ship the Beagle. He was an English botanist and naturalist. And he wrote The Origin of Species and some other books that described evolution. And it was bad enough that Copernicus and Galileo had taken us out of the center of the universe. What Darwin suggested directly in his book called The Descent of Man was that we were evolved from lesser species. This was a terrible narcissistic wound to what it meant to be human on this planet. It was terribly dangerous, a dangerous idea. It also made people more suspicious. And then, probably the worst blow, Marx, Karl Marx. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Karl Marx these days, but he's the guy that started communism. He wrote a book with his buddy Engels called The Communist Manifesto. And that theory, that economic theory, that theory of human nature, dominated for decades after. It wasn't until 1989 that the Soviet Union fell. It hasn't been until recently that communist China has transformed some of its Marxist ways of organizing society into a new, slightly more open way. But the key things for our purposes is that Marx's understanding of what it meant to be human was radically different, and I think radically scary. He said being human was nothing special. You were just a cog in the economic machine, and you could be replaced at any time. It's one of the terrifying reasons that most Marxist or communist regimes throughout history have been terribly, terribly deadly. We now, after Marx, have fallen a long way from being God's special children at the center of the universe. Along comes Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher from the 1880s. He said many things. One of the things that he's most famous for is, "Was bringt mich nicht macht mich stärker." I love the sound of it in German. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Most of you have heard that somewhere. I've heard it in movies before. The other thing he said that really shook people up was that God is dead. What did he mean by that? I mean, it's an outrageous thing to say. How the hell would he know that God is dead or not? He didn't mean literally. What he meant was he had seen Copernicus and Galileo and Darwin and Marx and their effect on culture. And what he meant by that was not that God is actually literally dead and buried somewhere, but that as a culture we no longer believe the way we used to. And I think he's probably right about that. I ask students all the time when I get to this part of the lecture, if you have religious beliefs, here's my question. Do you believe as powerfully and as strongly? And I don't care what religion you believe in. Do you believe as powerfully and as strongly as your grandparents, if you knew them? And the overwhelming majority of students always say no. And I think that's because just in their 2 generations, we've seen the masters of suspicion eating away at our ability to believe in dogmatic truth. I'm getting a little wordy here, I apologize. It'll make sense in a little bit. Stay with me. And then, of course, comes my guy, Freud, in the late 1800s and up to 1939 when he died. And he's responsible for the complete transformation of what it means to be human in this culture. And one of the key things is that he didn't recognize the existence of the unconscious. That had been talked about by lots of folks going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. But he gave it some scientific grounding. And so here we are. Copernicus says we're no longer the center of the universe. Darwin says we may not be God's special creation. Marx says we're just a unit in the means of economic production. Nietzsche says we're all alone in the universe anyway. And Freud says, the biggest insult of all maybe, we don't even know who we are because most of who we are is unconscious to us. And lastly, another French philosopher, Foucault, says we are simply thrown into a web of social power relationships. What does that mean? That's enough to drive anybody crazy. What it means simply is something that we now commonly believe today, that we just don't have that kind of fancy language to explain. It means that your culture is very powerful in determining your identity. I am a white male in 2009 in Seattle, Washington. American. I have just told you a lot about who I am, and I think most people would understand a lot about what I believe and where I come from if they knew that. If I was a Filipina woman in the 1850s from Manila, it's obvious I would be a radically different person. And not just the gender questions, but the cultural questions seem to be now more recognized as powerful than they've ever been. Okay, and what's the upshot of this? What's the take-home lesson? We don't believe in truth the way we used to. And when I'm talking about human relations, and when teachers are talking to you now, most of the time there's some expectation that you're going to get the truth, that you're going to get the way it is. You're going to get some reality-based understanding of things, facts, techniques, methods that are grounded in reality. The problem is our culture no longer believes in that the way it perhaps used to. Underneath the next section, I have got the words between dogmatism and deconstruction. This is our great cultural problem now. This is your problem now in trying to decide who you are and how the world works around you. 500 years ago, it was simple. If you had a question, you asked the priest. He told you. End of discussion. What's true? What's real? What should I do? Boom. The answers were straightforward. But over the course of 500 years, the cultural effect of these masters of suspicion have led us to call into question the very idea of truth, leading to the French idea, a lot of French philosophers in this work. Deconstruction, dogmatism, the belief in absolute truth. Deconstruction, the belief that no truth is possible at all. Now, I don't know about you folks, but I'm not sure this is an improvement. We've gone 500 years from dogmatism to deconstruction, and deconstruction is the big picture underneath which are words you know, you hear all the time. Multiculturalism and diversity. Those value systems are a derivative of this 500 years of cultural change. They're not true in some objective way. In fact, they're a derivative of a cultural shift away from the truth at all. The truth seems to have become rather subjective and relative. Okay, what am I supposed to do with that as a teacher? What are you supposed to do with that as a person trying to make their way in the world of work? I'm going to rebel against both. I can't tell you I know the truth. I'm going to talk in a few moments about all the different major theories in psychology, and the truth is there isn't much truth in there. But that doesn't mean we need to swing to the other extreme, deconstruction, as if there is no truth at all and our worlds are all just self-created. That sounds like 4-year-olds. When they don't get what they want, they stomp their feet and throw toys. We can't be 4-year-olds emotionally at the cultural level. So here's my answer, Donovan Bigelow's answer. I don't know if it's true, but maybe it works. Is what I'm teaching you, or what your teacher's teaching you, useful, adaptive? Does it make you stronger? If the answer to those questions are yes, you know what? Go with it. No teacher can tell you now that they're giving you the revealed truth, but no teacher is doing you any good if they say, it doesn't matter, it's all subjective. So my challenge to you is to take all the material I'm giving you, to take all the material all your teachers here at RTC give you, and try to gravitate toward the things that are useful, that help you become more adaptive in whatever field you're in. And maybe the bottom line, does this way of being, does this way of doing things, does this way of thinking make me stronger? And if the answer to those questions are yes, until a better idea comes along, go with it. And I think the alternatives are underneath that. Stoicism, aesthetic self-creation, or passive nihilism. I don't want to go any farther down the road to a philosophical discussion. The words underneath that may be important, though. Do you endure the way things are? Do you take the way things are and make something creative out of them? Or resignation? Do you simply resign yourself to suffer under the, as Shakespeare said, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? If you can stay to that middle, okay, every once in a while you have to endure. That's true. But if you can stay in a place that allows you to be creative, stay with an attitude that allows you to stay creative, you're going to be better off than if you're not. Is that true? I don't know, but it sure seems to work. And for my purposes today, that's probably enough. Okay, 7 perspectives in psychology. Now you can divide the field of psychology into 7 different fields, into 100 different fields, into 2. It depends on the particular psychologist or psychoanalyst perspective. But here's the scary part, and it's the part I feel bad about having to admit. If this class is about human relations, which means about what it means to be human in relationship, and that means trying to understand your minds, I have to admit that no one knows what the word mind means. No one knows what the mind is. We're pretty sure it's in the brain. For some guys, I'm not so sure that's true, but mostly it's in the brain. But they don't know where in the brain, and they don't know how to make the leap between pure biology of the brain and the psychology of the mind. And it's frustrating to be a teacher in a field where the fundamental issue is unclear. And again, that's just the way the field is. I can't help that. What I can do is give you these perspectives, and here's the story that I think is useful. It comes from the subcontinent India, South Asia, India, not Native American Indians, but India Indians. And the story is several hundred years old, and I've had this confirmed by a couple of students of mine from India. They've actually heard it in their childhood, so that was nice. It's the story of the 7 blind wise men and the elephant. And here's the story. The pasha, or the king, whoever was in charge back then, calls in his 7 blind wise men, blind from birth, but they're very wise. And he brings in an elephant, and he asks them to examine the elephant and tell him what an elephant is. And the one walks up to the elephant and runs into his leg. And he holds the leg and he says to the pasha, an elephant is like a tree. And the other one walks in and runs into the tail, holds the tail. An elephant is like a rope. And the one walks into the wall of the elephant, the side of the elephant. It feels like a wall. And he says, of course, an elephant is like a wall. The last guy, the trunk, you understand, the trunk. An elephant is like a snake. Question, are they right or are they wrong? And okay, it's a tricky question because they're neither right or wrong. No, an elephant isn't like a snake, isn't like a rope, isn't like a tree. But they've got a piece of the elephant, okay? And that's what the 7, and it's interesting to me that there's 7 main theories in psychology. Each of the perspectives in psychology has a piece of the human mind. And if you can put it all together, then I think you have something useful that will help you in your human relations, in your workplace, become more effective and more adaptive. Let me walk through very briefly an overview of each of these perspectives. Number 1, it all started with Freud, the psychoanalytic model. Now, Freud innovated a couple of things that remain profoundly important today. He understood the power and the control and the inevitability of the unconscious, how so much of what we do is not consciously thought through, but motivated by unconscious drives. He also understood a concept called transference, and you all know this is true. I do things, I react to people, not objectively, scientifically, not based on just on what I see and do in the here and now. If, for example, I had a real tough dad, authoritarian, very discipline-oriented, and he yelled at me a lot, and I grow up, and I go to school, and I come to RTC, and I get into a great program, and I graduate, top of my class, and then I go get a job. And my first boss turns out to be a tyrant, a disciplinarian. And he comes by my office, or my desk, the first day. Bigelow, clean up that desk, it's a mess. What the hell's wrong with you? And leaves. Now, how do I react to that? Do I react to that just based on what I see him here and do? No, I react to him from my whole being, from all of my childhood experiences with that kind of a father. I transfer my emotional response from my childhood into my current work environment. If you don't get that, folks, you will not be effective in the workplace. You've got to understand that you're bringing something to the table. You're bringing an emotional response to the table that will affect how you perceive reality. If you can tell the difference between feelings and facts, you're in much better shape than if you can't. How many times has someone made you angry and you overreacted? And the next day you apologize. I don't know what I was thinking. I just blew up. I bet transference was in play. You were reacting from an emotional, unconscious perspective, and it didn't work very well in the real world. The last 100 years, we've struggled with Freud's ideas. In the 20s, some folks came along the behaviorists, I'm now on the middle bottom of page 7 of the notes, they thought Freud was crazy. They thought it was ridiculous. There's no such thing as the mind. You can't measure it. You can't touch it. You can't smell it, feel it. Who cares? The only thing that counts is what you do. What you do is who you are, not what your mama did when you were a kid. That's a very powerful way of thinking. It actually works. If you're an alcoholic, what did the behaviorists say? Stop drinking. If you don't drink too much, you're not an alcoholic. End of discussion. You don't need to talk about your mama. Okay? There's something almost intuitively reasonable about that position. You know, if you're a wife abuser, stop abusing your wife. You won't be one anymore. That makes such sense in a simple world. The humanists came along after World War II. It's hard for those of us who haven't lived through a world war, and I haven't, obviously. The Vietnam War, but that was a long time ago as well. It's hard for us to appreciate the devastation of World War II. The entire world was inflamed virtually. And almost everything that everybody believed prior to that was destroyed. Much of our faith in religion was destroyed. The churches were destroyed literally. Our inability to contain the two opposite things, the destruction and a belief in God, called people's faith into question over and over again. Our belief in government failed. Our belief in community failed. Our families were destroyed. It was a shocking and traumatic experience. The word trauma just doesn't do it justice. And yet some folks had to figure out how to survive after that. These were the humanists, and they said, okay, look, we can't get meaning from the outside anymore. We can't get meaning from our institutions. We have to create meaning within ourselves. And out of the rubble of World War II came this school of psychological thought that said, this is where it has to be. If I'm going to have meaning in my life, then I've got to create it for myself. And that's one of the strains. It's the only perspective in psychology that seems to look more toward the future than the past. And it feels useful to me. Okay, along comes the 50s, and we have the cognitive revolution. Computers start getting invented in the 50s, and psychologists linked up with the computer people and said, hey, maybe the mind works like that. Input, output. The way you think is really the way you are. Change the way you think, you change the way you are. Also, intuitively, it makes sense. All right? And that's still a very powerful paradigm. It dominates most of the undergraduate and graduate psychology institutions in America. It's the core theory of a cognitive and behaviorist perspectives dominate all the books in human relations. We now have, since the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now, neurobiology, this way of thinking about the mind that Freud was hoping would work out someday, but he never saw it. CAT scans, PET scans, neurological evaluations through technology that allow us to see into the functioning human brain. That's giving us a window that Freud nor any other psychologist before him could have ever had. And the hope is, though not yet real, is that if we can fix the brain, if we can understand the brain, then hopefully we can help people's mental illness, which remains a psychological mystery in many ways. The newest version is evolutionary psychology, and we're going to talk about this quite a bit in the next hour. But it's the idea that biology counts, that we have certain tendencies, we have certain predispositions. We're hardwired in some ways by evolution to perform in certain general ways. And we need to understand what's biologically hardwired before we try to change it. Now, this is hotly contested, and my position on evolution is very simple. It does not need to call into question anyone's religious beliefs, because I'm going to carve out a chunk for evolutionary psychology here. The chunk between now and about 1 million years ago. It's pretty clear that science has shown us the Earth is 4, 5, 6 billion years old, and people have been on it a long time. But it seems to me that however we got here, whether God created us or we followed Darwin out of the swamp, we have evolved. And those who survive because of particular genetic traits that are a bit random, but happen to have an adaptive advantage in a particular environment. More on this later. The idea simply is human behavior isn't random, and we are the survivors of those who had certain traits in previous environments. It's a useful way of thinking about why we do some of the silly things we keep doing today. and the socio-cultural perspective. This was the perspective that really grew up in the 60s around thinkers like Foucault, the French guy, and some others, who talk about how important it is to recognize the cultural value systems, the time and place, the cultural values that really are the center of who we become in that particular time and place. Okay, that's the short version of 7 perspectives that I think if you take a little bit of each of them, if you understand a little bit of each of them, then you'll understand better who you are. You'll understand better how you work with others on the job. You'll understand the hierarchical relationship in any business, and you'll be a better worker. Last line on page 7, the search for a principled basis for deciding the question, who am I? I think all of these perspectives lead to an answer to that question. Not the final answer, a tentative answer, an answer that's useful for you, an answer you can take and make yourself more productive in the workplace, an answer that will help you get along with your coworkers and your bosses better, that I think will allow you, if you answer it honestly and work at it for a while, will give you a much superior opportunity to succeed. Thank you.